In this module, we're going to discuss malware, identity theft, and fraud. So what is malware? So this is probably about as technical as we're going to get throughout the semester, just in terms of terminology and some of the technical components of hacking. What I want you to do is familiarize yourself with these terms so that when we've discussed hackers and we've discussed different types of motivations, that you know what it is that's being done, because you may hear of different types of hacks. And so malware is a type of hack, right? And so what it is, it's a piece of software. And so it's designed with malicious intent. So that means that the hacker is somebody that could write a piece of software, they've written code, and it's designed to be able to infiltrate and to be able to infect a device. And so a lot of times what happens is much like a virus, or there's different types of malware, but the user, without knowing, and they unwittingly download or they install the malware, and then this goes through and infects the device, and this can then spread from computer to computer. So when we think of malware, traditionally it's something that we've always thought of as a virus, or kind of those old school computer viruses and antivirus software. But as technology has become enhanced, and as so have the hacks, and now malware becomes an umbrella term that looks at different types of viruses and so these different types of malware. So for example, your adware, if you've ever had something installed on your computer and it just continuously just pops up all of these ads and goes often to a malicious site. So it's programmed to do that. Bots, there's good bots and bad bots, but these are malware bots. So they actually are performing a task. And so a lot of times that's taking down websites, or as we talked about, the denial of service attack. So this is something that's gone through into your system and is targeting something. And so this can be a denial of service attacks or to take down the website. So bugs. In the hacking module, we talked about, say, bug bounty. So these are not always intentional malware. Okay, so this can be just somebody who's writing code, and if you think of a bug, it's almost like a typo, right? That you might write in something like your papers or anything like that. It's an error in the software. But what happens is a hacker can exploit that bug, and so they can cause it to possibly produce an error. They can cause the software to crash. Sometimes it provides a gateway into the software where they can really do some malicious things. So bugs is essentially, it's a very good window. They can also inject bugs or failures into software. Ransomware. So this is a piece of software or something that it hijacks either your website content or your computer, and it demands payment. So it literally is like asking for ransom in exchange for your content. And so when we talked about some of the financial motivations for some hackers, ransomware, they can literally hold data for ransom or hold service for ransom and ask for money in exchange for the access. Spyware. So this is something that is spying and monitoring on your user activity. So if it can monitor your keystrokes, it can monitor credit card information, passwords, access numbers, anything. Trojan horse. So what this does is it disguises itself as something else. So it might look like a software that you would normally install. It can look like an app that you might normally install. And instead of it actually being the app, it could be a dummy app. And now you've installed something that you thought was okay, and it's not. Virus, in the traditional form of what we've known for, that would kind of encounter all of this, is so it's malicious script or software that somebody has written that goes onto your computer. And the virus tends to corrupt like an entire system, and it can actually really harm the computer itself too. So if you ran a virus scanning software, sometimes you get viruses and you don't really even realize that. It can come through attachments, it can come through shared files. This is really probably the most common one to spread from user to user. Something like adware or bots or ransomware, it's very targeted, and it can be much harder to sort of innocently spread by opening an email that you got from a family member or something like that. Whereas a virus can be spread fairly easily, but also the types of prevention now are much better at recognizing and preventing viruses. But for most people, through lots of experience and prevention against viruses, know to not just download software or attachments when they come from people that you don't know. There's been a lot of education around what we traditionally know as viruses, but things like adware, ransomware, spyware, Trojan horses, especially. We'll talk about that with identity theft and fraud. It's very easy to become victims to lots of types of malware. And then worms. So this is a worm that it goes through and it can consume bandwidth. So this can overload web servers. So it's a targeted attack against web servers that can find failures, it can replicate, and then easily spread to other devices through the internet, through different servers. So all of these different attacks are types of hacks known as malware, so malicious software. And they're common tools, approaches that hackers can use. And so that you have people that can write this software, they can write the spyware, the Trojan horse, and we will use and find ways to look like something that you want to open, that you want to download. So why do they use malware? So financial motivation, there's motives for like extortion, such as ransomware. There's an intellectual challenge. A lot of software designers and coders, they enjoy writing code. They enjoy writing. And when you have something that is a puzzle, that can you inject something that can get around an antivirus or something that can prevent malware, but are you able to find a way around it? That can be a very strong intellectual challenge. Social acceptances. So when we talked about hackers, we talked about the social norms and the notion of acceptance, being part of a group. So there may be the ability to be part of a hacker group, or maybe there's somebody that you've been talking with, especially for juveniles, who what happens is that you have somebody older and experienced who pairs up with somebody who's looking for that social acceptance, and then they work with that up and coming hacker to implement the malware, again, because perhaps the end result may not be as dangerous or as problematic for a juvenile as it may be for an adult. So vengeance, sometimes there's just something where they actually want to target somebody. It could be targeting a company that fired them. It could be targeting a significant other. There's lots of different reasons why there may be vengeance there, and vengeance could even fall into like hacktivism of, are you doing this to expose information? Are you building something that can tunnel in and provide you with access? We tend to think less of hacktivists with malware because malware is meant really to cause harm and to cause damage to a system. It's a denial of service. It's overflowing web servers. It's less about extorting information, which is what hacktivists often look for. And malware is much more of a vengeful, looking to destroy approach. So you may find that more of the hackers that we would term as malicious hackers are looking to use malware to cause harm. And then another reason which you might not think about is this notion of vandalism and art and chaos, and almost like graffiti. So when somebody goes and they hack into a website and they overload it, or they're able to redesign it, and for some hackers, it's like leaving their mark, and the chaos that they can create, there becomes an art in that. So when we talked about in the hackers module of the different hacker ethics and ethos, is that computers can be art, and that hacking can be art, and that to create a piece of software that then goes and does something, that there can be an art to hacking, but a chaos in it too. And we think about that when we're in real life, and we look at like, why do people just throw a rock through a window, or break or let the air out of someone's tires, or do any of this sort of crazy, chaotic actions that do harm other people? So we have to ask that question of, why does vandalism occur? And is this just the digital version of vandalism? If somebody takes a bat and starts, breaking in car windows, doesn't take anything, doesn't steal anything, but just does it for the sake of doing it, we stop and we ask ourselves, why? Why it would cause somebody to just go around and destroy things with no what seems to be no motive behind it? And so in some ways, using malware, creating or designing malware, is akin to vandalism or graffiti, or effectively leaving your mark and just creating chaos for the sake of chaos. So when we look at types of malware writers, because what the human brain does is it looks for patterns. We want to be able to profile. We want to be able to say, we understand why somebody would do this. Because when we can understand them, then maybe we can come closer to anticipating or preventing them. But unfortunately, there's not really a clear type of perpetrator, much in the same way there's not really a clear type of hacker. There's lots of different types of motivations. There's things that may come into consideration when we're looking at the different types. So we don't want to get stuck into there being a certain typology. We can look at age, and can age play a factor into the role of being a malware writer? And much like we talked about again with the hackers module of it can be divided up, what some research has found, into age groups. And some of this has to do with the likelihood of prosecution. So if you have a young adolescent who meets a mature ex-virus writer, that ex-virus writer may write a piece of malware, distribute it to the college student or the young adolescent, because their prosecution is not going to be as strong for somebody who's a professional or a mature ex-virus writer. So if you were, say, Kevin Mitnick, who had created this amazing hack, had gone to jail for it, you're probably going to think twice before doing another hack. And I'm not saying Kevin Mitnick is doing this. He is now a white hat hacker, but for somebody who is not and may not have come out in favor of white hat hacking, but you may find somebody who can implement the virus with them. So you're mentoring them as a malware writer, but yet you're letting this young adolescent or college student effectively be the person who you take under your wing and shadow, and they may be the person who implements it. And you may never know who the writer is. And they literally are that shadowy figure in the dark or part of a hacker group. So as you'll see in the textbook, there is some discussion, and it kind of goes around a little bit in circles of, well, what is the typology? Who writes malware? What is their motivation? Why do they do this? And is it possible to profile? And thus far, there's not really research yet, and this could just be a yet issue, in the same way that we might be able to profile other types of forensics or crime. And I think that this is what's interesting with cybercrime, and we'll go when we go through the different modules throughout the semester that will come up, is because this is new, that 30 years ago, do we have to worry about malware writers in the same way that we could say, okay, well, I know why somebody might break into my house. Well, we know why somebody might break into your house if you leave the door unlocked and a wad of cash sitting down on the table. But what does that mean in a virtual world? What makes somebody susceptible? What tempts somebody? So there's a lot of research right now that goes in a lot of different directions that we try to make sense of. But as of right now, there's not really a clear type of perpetrator. So when we profile, when we think about who would write malware, we want to look to the motivations and look to the case study itself to figure out what could be happening here, and to remember the relationship dynamics between hackers and between hacker groups. So in preventing malwares, how do we prevent this? If there are people out there and we could be victims to malware, how do we prevent it? And this is a big question for a lot of companies. And I think that if you speak with any cybersecurity professional, especially a white hat, this is one of the basis for computer security and why the field exists, is because companies are trying to come up with software that will prevent and secure organizations. And so while you can write software to combat other software, malicious software, antivirus software, anti-malware software, unfortunately, really the human element of prevention is the basis for prevention. So what we want to do is we need to educate people on the importance of cybersecurity. And so we begin to look at, okay, protection motivation theory. And this is something that can span beyond just cybersecurity, but just in general. And so what does it take for somebody to want to protect themselves? And a lot of times it's up to the person. If you're walking through a particular neighborhood, you may not feel safe. And so you may take action to protect yourself in a way that you wouldn't. Or I can walk through this neighborhood at night and I feel safe, but I don't feel comfortable walking through this other neighborhood. So what causes us to protect ourselves in our real world? And then what does that look like in a virtual world? And so there are a lot of similarities. And so the first is the person at risk? Do they believe that they could be a victim? And so this is hard because when we're online, because we're anonymous, because we don't look around and say, oh, okay, I know that the person who sent me this email is a hacker. we can't tell. We're just looking at the words. So there has to become that piece of awareness to look for the patterns and, okay, does this sound like somebody who I would be getting an email from, which we'll talk about with identity theft and fraud in a moment. But so believing they're at risk and that they could be a victim, belief that their prevention will be effective, and their ability to use these protective measures. So this comes up a lot with passwords. Okay? So if I come up with this amazing complex password, is that enough? Can I still be hacked with it? Will I remember the password, or will I end up just having to reset it to something very similar? Is there value in this? Do I really need to come up with a difficult password? How much, how much of a victim am I? They're not going to bother me. It's okay if I use the same password everywhere, because the sacrifice may not be worth the prevention. Convenience is really one of the things that makes people prone to becoming a victim of, especially with identity theft and fraud. But in prevention is, are we willing to give up the essence of convenience that we can have to be able to run the software, to enter our credit card into a site that looks safe and secure, to spend the extra time in making sure that we're careful. So all these things that we want to make sure we're not downloading the software, or that we're running these programs before opening them, because we are able to prevent a lot of these, but there has to have this motivation from the human side to not become susceptible, and to also then to know what to do when attacked with malware, to be able to recognize malware. So in bringing to identity theft and fraud, because malware is a bit more of a technical term, your average person, if you probably went home and asked your family, they may or may not be familiar with malware and what each of the types of malware are. But many people have been affected by identity theft and fraud. So a lot of times these go hand in hand. But when we look at identity theft, so it's the use of someone else's documentation or personal information. So this is, has somebody ever taken your credit card? Have they hacked into your Facebook or your social media and pretended to be you? Fraud is actual use of deception or trickery with the intent to deceive for personal gain. Right? So identity theft, you're actually stealing somebody else's identity. Fraud, you're tricking them, you're lying, you're pretending to be something that you aren't. And they can occur within the same crime, which is why they often do get lumped together. So common types of identity theft, how do they get to your identity? And it's not unlike social engineering, but what is called phishing. And so a hacker launches this phishing attack, and what they do is they're trying to figure out how to trick you to make you believe that the message is from a legitimate source, so that you click the link and download an attachment that then can open up the malware. So these hackers can spend a lot of time crafting an email address that looks like an email address that you might know, or that might look familiar, or they may call you and say, I'm from Amazon, please call this number so we can fix your account. And then you call the number and they have it redirect, and it sounds just like that you're giving your information to Amazon. So they say, we need to call you about this account, or we're going to email you. And so you click the link and it goes to a new website, and it may look like Amazon. It can even be a phone number that looks, when it shows up in your phone, it looks like it's coming from your significant other. I mean, there's a lot of ways that phishing attacks can really try to trick you into believing that it's a legitimate source, which is why we say, don't just give your credit card information. If somebody calls you and asks you for your credit card information, you want to hang up the phone and call back, or check and make sure. So an example is, I was at an event doing a conference, and there were rooms in a hotel block, and then there was a hotel room block that was very similar. It was this email that was sent out, and it had all similar information. It looked like it was coming from the same place, and it's a click this website, this link, and enter in your information to confirm your room block. And of course, it was a phishing attempt, and a lot of people fell for it. And so the event people had to go back and say, no, that's not us. You will never get email asking, with anybody except for the person who's managing your account. So companies do try and be proactive about warning you if it looks like there's phishing attempts coming from someone similar to them. But in general, we do want to try and educate people and direct them to confirm their information or to not give credit card or personal information unless validating somehow. Social networking fraud. So again, these are some of the common ones. So a social networking, especially one that I've seen the most is the Facebook one, where someone creates a mirror account. So they take your profile photo and so any of your public items that are available, and they put it on a separate account, because most people don't actually look to see what your personal link is. I mean, if I asked you right now to say, okay, if you have a Facebook account or an Instagram account, do you actually know what, or a Twitter account, do you actually know what your friends and family, what their actual URLs or usernames are? Some you might know, especially if it's Twitter, but they change. So then what they do is then they add your friends and contacts, and then from the mirror account, they can ask for personal information, instruct them to go to a website. And they're preying upon the human emotions of trust and greed and fear, and guilt and compassion. So an example of this, I can tell you, my mother's given me approval or authority anyway, not what she proves, but that I can use her as my example, because she had somebody very close to her. Somebody had hacked into her friend's account. The friend messaged her and started asking how she was, and they were catching up, and then said, oh, there's this new website that's out for seniors, and if you enter in your information and it turns out that you're on this list, you can get up to $5,000 back. And now it was coming from somebody that my mother trusts, so she thought this is mirror account, but she didn't know that. And hey, I mean, your friend says, oh, if you do this, you can get $5,000. It sounds pretty good. And so she ended up doing it. And then, sure enough, it was a phishing, it was fraud. And so we had to go back and cancel all sorts of things, and made a big mess. But this is something, I mean, these people are experts at it. They spend their days perfecting their fraud and how they can get to your contacts, how they can get personal information, but how they can exploit human emotions of trust and fear. And very much like when we discuss social engineering, these are very similar to social engineering attacks, because they're looking at the human factor. Okay, so it's looking at creating fraud or identity theft based on social engineering, based on what we know about the way that humans connect each other. There's nothing particularly technical about this. They're just making a Facebook account, but they know how to talk to people in a way that gains trust, in a way that gets them that hook that sounds really good, or gets them to have compassion of, oh, I need help. I've just, there's I say a GoFundMe. There's lots of GoFundMe frauds. I need help. Please share my story. And then it turns out to be a fraud. So we always want to double check and educate and check for, is something real? Can it be validated? Check with the person, just make sure that this is a real one. And if something feels off, sometimes people that you talk with a lot, you may understand the cadence of the way that they chat. Sometimes people have a certain way, they use lots of smiley faces, or they don't. Or so if somebody else then messages you and it doesn't seem like a typical conversation that you might have, something may kind of ring in the back of your mind of, this doesn't seem right. Follow that gut instinct too, because if something doesn't seem like it's all adding up, then check. Hey, do you mind if I give you a call? Can I get your email? I'm going to email you there. And then is it the email that you have for them? Just double checking and creating awareness that all of this exists, that these things can happen. So the Facebook hack doesn't seem to work as much anymore, because that still happens. People are aware of it. When somebody with someone else's name adds you and you're like, but I'm already friends with them, a little red flag goes up. Online dating fraud, otherwise known, you may have heard it as catfishing. It's a whole show just dedicated to it. But specifically with fraud and catfishing, where while it can be damaging for a lot of different reasons, especially for a relationship and personal side, it can also be very dangerous just in terms of fraud and taking advantage of people, of asking for money, of trying to create a relationship with somebody, and then they have major expenses that they need help with. And So whether or not it's true, whether or not they've made requests for money, but they're actively going around and getting in relationships with people and then taking money from them. And so they do that by creating a persona and investing time and effort into a relationship with somebody. So again, creating that awareness of don't try not to give people money. And coming back, of course, to the victims, because especially for identity theft, especially for fraud, the depression, the stress, the anxiety, the violation, everything that can happen, that when you think you've been talking to your friend and you're giving them money, and then all of a sudden you're having to change all of your credit cards and you've got all your information, you feel violated and it's scary. And how do you trust anything? And we always want to remember the psychological responses, to remember the victims of these people who are being hacked, because it becomes so easy to dehumanize the computer experience, that when we are compromised, that it can be very, very stressful. If anybody, chances are you do know somebody who has had identity theft or credit card fraud, or has had to go through the bank, or your bank has locked you for credit card fraud, and you have to call them and say, no, you just locked me out of all of my charges that I was trying to make, right? We become this world that we don't know if something is real or not. It can really have severe psychological responses. So then we keep coming back to that, because we always want to humanize the cyber psychology experience. And your biggest way of preventing is to create awareness. So public awareness of the risks, protecting financial accounts, not giving away information, choose strong passwords, even though it can be a pain in the neck to have a strong password and a different password for every website and every account, to actually choose those strong passwords. And it's okay even to have a notebook where you write it down. Some people have to do that. That actually nowadays may be more secure than keeping it on your computer or keeping it saved in there, because digitally you may be it may be more susceptible to being a victim than you are just having a notebook in your desk drawer. You want to encourage companies to educate their customers and their employees also, though, about the risks. So much like that, as I was saying, the event company that warned everybody, if somebody asks about a hotel block that's not from us, don't ignore that. Don't be sure to ignore that, report it, let us know. And so because they had educated their customers and consumers, people knew to look out for it and call it out when it happened. Now, the last two, while including these because they are awareness, there's some caveats with that just to consider. So newer technologies such as biometrics. But we always want to know where our information is going. So if you sit down and your webcam, say, scans your eyes, and now that's something that you're able to have access to, or face awareness with your phone. Now, Apple is really good about not sharing data, but what if you were able to scan, say, your biometrics, and then that was able to be recognized somewhere? So I can tell you an example of at my kids' preschool one time, is they gave the example, or they gave us the opportunity to have our children's fingerprints scanned. And the premise behind that was it was a service that would keep the fingerprints. And then if your child was ever taken, you would have access to their fingerprints and could hopefully find them more. And to say that we discussed this for a while and ultimately decided not to do it, because giving up, even though they were 3, and I'm hopefully not raising criminals, but that just the privacy of having their fingerprints, that's their fingerprints, that was their privacy. But did it possibly find a way of recognizing them? Could it possibly, can biometrics increase security and weed out hackers? Yes, it likely can. But is it a trade-off for a violation of privacy? Do you want your biometrics out there, anywhere? Clearly for some people it's not an issue. There's actually the Clear app that, or the airport. There's things that we do scan. We do use fingerprints. You use fingerprints to get into Disney World. They use fingerprints, or did. But just with the caveat of, is this a violation of privacy? Anytime you're asking somebody to give up information, what happens with that data? So if somebody's giving you or you're giving somebody their biometrics, what happens to that data? So let's just caveat with that. And then another option is to impose severe penalties for perpetrators. There's no right or wrong here, but just something to consider. Do severe penalties work? This one has been a longer debate than even cyber psychology has been around. When does the punishment fit the crime? Should there be severe penalties for perpetrators? What constitutes severe penalties? So for those last two, yes, they do create awareness. Yes, they can be ways that deter perpetrators. We know that penalties do matter, but is that something, is there a cost associated with some of the awareness versus, say, choosing a strong password or encouraging companies to educate customers? So we're always looking at the trade-off. When you give something, is something also being taken away? So that is the high-level overview, non-technical, I hope, for malware and identity theft and fraud. And so some of the ways that when we talked about hackers and profiling hackers, but now some of the activities that hackers can engage in, especially malicious ones. So if you have any questions, you can shoot me an email or you know where to find me. And otherwise, until the next module. Thanks.